Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name's Stephen and I'm a traditionally published fantasy author. Today I'm going to talk to you about editing a novel. This is quite a big subject, so I'm probably going to do it over a couple of videos, and this is something that I'll revisit. But I'm going to talk to you about some different ways or different approaches. I can't talk to you about how I do it because it's kind of difficult to describe, so I'm just going to talk through some general practices, and you can pick and choose things that seem right for you that you could try to help you. One of the most difficult things is turning your first draft into a second draft, and that's a huge challenge, and I have struggled with it in the past and still do, but I've developed certain techniques and I've read about other techniques that I'm going to share with you today to help you. So the first thing you should do when you finish that first draft is to take a break. Now I know that sounds counterproductive, but the problem is you've spent months, years possibly working on this novel, and you've been so close to it. It's like the old cliche, you can't see the wood for the trees, and it's true in this case. You've been this close to it the whole time. You've been right down in the mud, getting into it, building it, working on it, and what you've been doing is translating an idea that was in your head onto the page. And there's going to be a difference between the two, but you won't be able to see it straight away. You could give it to someone else to read, but I probably wouldn't, not with that first draft, because if you tell them what the initial idea was and you give them that first draft, their first comment is probably going to be, well, it's a bit different to what you described, and that's not really a good place to start. So take a break, put it in a drawer, metaphorically speaking, and leave it alone. One, this gives you a chance for your brain to rest and recover. If you want to make notes, scribble down ideas, things that you know you need to address, things that you've been in the back of your mind, I must go back and fix this. Write them down somewhere and put them to one side and give yourself some space to breathe and go out and do something different that's not writing, because you need to rest your brain. So go and do some physical exercise, visit friends, watch TV, whatever it might be. Take some time away. That's the first thing I suggest. Now when you come back after a break of at least 10 days, maybe 2 weeks if you can, longer if you need it to rest and recover, come back and then look at what you originally wrote down or what you originally planned, or even if it was just the original idea that you had if you don't plan your novels, and then standing back, not reading every chapter and every line and verse, look at the two and see where the differences are. Did you hit the target of what you were going for? Let's say you're writing a comedy novel. How funny is it? Now I know comedy is subjective, so maybe that's not a good example. Maybe like a thriller. Is it really exciting? The other thing for the thriller is obviously going to be pace. How fast paced is it? Is it really slow? Are you plodding along through the chapters? So at a distance you can look at the genre, I'm assuming you read within the genre that you're writing. You should do. If you don't, I think that's something you should correct. So you know the kind of book that you're writing, you know the kind of book that you read and you enjoy. How far away is it from that original goal? And do probably what is going to be a lot of cutting to begin with. So this is, if the pace is slow, focus on that and say, right, okay, this chapter lags here, or this character drifts off and do something, it doesn't really tie in. Work on pace. That's one thing you could do. Second thing you can do is look at character. When you imagine the characters originally in your head and you looked at them now, are they as you thought they were going to be? Did the character arcs end up where you wanted them to? Even with me with planning novels, sometimes I find weird kinks in the storyline that develop that I didn't anticipate. Sometimes they're useful, but sometimes they're not. And you have to kind of course correct the book. And it's all about clarity. It's clarity of vision from what you originally anticipated and planned to what you ended up with. Are the characters as you want them to be? How do they interact? The third thing is obviously dialogue. Do a dialogue sweep through the entire book. Look at the conversations. Listen to people, watch them on TV and films and in the street. Is the dialogue realistic? Does it sound like you want it to? If they've got a particular way of speaking, is it consistent? Some people say you should be able to read a piece of dialogue and know whichever character is speaking without having their name attached. I think that's actually a little bit far-fetched, because sometimes characters don't have that unique a voice that you can read one sentence and know exactly who it is. So don't worry about that too much, but look at the tone of the character. If you've got someone who's really cocky and loud and in your face and brash, are they always like that? And if so, why is that? And then is that because they're putting up a front, and in other scenes they're a bit quieter and more thoughtful and you get to see the true self? So it's things like that. Digging into the character, looking at the voice, looking at the dialogue, and seeing if that all hangs together well. The next thing you could do is world building. This is a subject that I could spend several videos talking about, so I'm only going to go into it in quite light detail, and it's probably something I will revisit again in the future. I tend to talk about fantasy, obviously because that's the kind of novels I'm talking about and I write, but world building really applies to any novel. If you're writing a novel in the current world, contemporary world, like a crime novel, you have to get your research right. Even if it's a city that you know fairly well, you have to be consistent with details so that someone who picks it up and hasn't visited the city or hasn't been there will be able to understand it. You need to describe it in a level of detail, but not too much detail. I know that's also kind of a personal preference thing, but you don't want to spend 7 pages describing the style of gargoyle on a church because you know it really well and you really like it and you think it'll be really fascinating. If it's not integral to the plot, reduce it, really cut it down. Especially if you're writing, say, like a thriller novel, you don't want something that's really slow. So pace comes into it again. But if you're writing any kind of fictional world, then consistency is key. If you've got magic systems and you're doing fantasy, that can be more complicated again. But there again, even fantasy, some people say with fantasy novels, oh, you can just make anything up and it doesn't really matter. The exact opposite is true, really. Because if you do make it up, it has to hang together, absolutely. Magic has to have rules, it has to be consistent, and it has to work so that a reader doesn't just get to a point and go, all I've done is wave their hand and they fix all the problems. It's just this MacGuffin that you've invented. So it creates problems of its own kind. So you need to be consistent. The other thing to think about is engaging the senses in any kind of genre that you're writing. Think about, you go outside your house and you go for a walk, round the block, down to the shop, whatever it might be. Think about everything that you see, everything that you hear, everything that you smell, everything that you touch. Maybe you walk past other people, or there's a dog that you pet, or there's a nice bush that you see and you touch and it has nice flowers. And all of these things that you see and you absorb every day that you take for granted, you have to translate some of that into the world that you're creating so that the reader will also feel as if they are there. You don't have to describe every single sense, every single moment, so that as soon as a character steps out the door, they go, oh, look at the lovely blue sky, and look at that lovely black road, and look at the, oh, I can smell this, and I can smell... It doesn't need to be to that detail, because you don't do that in your own life. Describe details that are important, that are relevant, that are interesting, and that are engaging at the level that is appropriate. So that's something difficult sometimes to judge for yourself, which is why later on I was going to mention beta readers. So world building, focus on that as another way of looking at the people, the places, the clothing. Think about the religions, think about the cities and the structures and the architecture, think about modes of transport and travel, think about the magic system if you're doing fantasy. Think about weapons, think about armor, and all of this then lends into things like trade. If they're producing leather armor, therefore they get the material from animals. What kind of animals? And therefore, if they're producing leather, they've got tanneries. Tanneries are incredibly smelly. Look it up in history, you'll find out all about it. The way they produce leather stinks, absolutely stinks if you're doing it properly. And you're curing leather. Maybe they produce metal armor, or they have metal swords. Is it steel? Is it iron? Is it bronze? What level of technology do they have? Therefore, if they've got armor and weapons and swords, they've got smiths. Therefore, they know how to smelt metal. Therefore, they've got blacksmiths. And you see, it just sort of steamrolls and builds it up appropriately. If you have something and you've built it in the world and the people never encounter it, then that's fine. You don't need to put it on the page, which is why sometimes if you're doing world building before you start writing the novel, maybe only 10% of what I sometimes call a world Bible will end up on the page. And that's fine. It means that if you suddenly veer left on the road instead of the right because you're writing by the seat of your pants, or suddenly feel that you should go in that direction, The road isn't empty, the world is not empty. You've already planned it out because you've done it in your World Bible, so it's never wasted. But there again, it's consistent. It's creating something that feels real, that when the reader picks up the page, sees what your characters are doing, it feels legitimate, it feels genuine, and they don't suddenly get pulled out of the story. So those are just some of the initial ways you can look at editing your book and translating it from a first draft to a second draft. The next thing you could do, I mentioned a little earlier, is beta readers. This is a small group of people that you trust to read the book and give you genuine and honest feedback. But what you should do, rather than just give them the book, I would suggest is pose certain questions. I mean, they could just give you their initial opinion and let you know what they think of it in terms of pace and story and characters and consistency, and that's fine. But if there's certain aspects that you're worried about or you think need developing, pose them questions and say, how do you feel about this character? Do you like this character? Do you hate this character? That's what you're trying to do. Because sometimes I've written a book and I've given it to my editor and they've come back and said, well, this character, do they need to be there? They don't feel very particularly important. And to me, I've thought, well, of course they're important. And then I've gone back and read what is actually on the page. And there isn't as much as I thought because some of it is still in my head. So I then developed that character. And when I gave it back to my editor the next time, she said, okay, I can see this makes perfect sense why this character is now there, because they've got more agency and they do this and they do that. So go in with certain questions if you can to your beta readers in addition to getting general feedback. As I said, that's just a very kind of quick way of looking at some editing tips. There's a lot more I could talk about and it's probably something I'm going to come back to in a future video. If you've got any questions as ever about editing or any of the other topics I've talked about, get in touch, let me know, post a comment, like and subscribe. That would really help me out if you can. And I'll be back very soon.